Okay, hi everybody, good afternoon. My name is Jasmine Raymond. I'm the curator of DIA Art Foundation, and it's a pleasure to see you all here for this last discussion of the season. As many of you know, this is our temporary program space here in Chelsea, and this is the Discussions in Contemporary Culture series, a lecture program that started in 1987. It was first under the direction of Hal Foster, who I think was here or coming, or should be coming. He's no longer involved, but we force him. But he and others continue to guide this amazing program throughout the late 80s and into the 90s, including Gary Gerals, Barbara Kruger, Phil Mariani, Brian Wallace, Gina Dent, Gretchen Bender, Timothy Ducree, Lynn Cook, and Peter Wallen. During the first stage of the program, of the series, between the 87 and 97, the program presented a number of symposia and publications that went along that were regarded by many as really innovative and important for forming discourses and conditions on the present day cultural developments and artistic production. We reinstated the program in 2012. And we did the honor of inviting Hal again. We had the honor of having him back as a nod and as a token of gratitude. In conversation with the Swiss artist Thomas Hirschen, maybe some of you attended that first conversation. And then we moved forward with an official series after that, which started under the guidance of Manuel Sirauki, who is assistant curator here at DIA. The title of this program is Monumentality, and Monumentalization. And the hope was that to expand on the critical interest in examining the status of the monument in global culture, as well as the possibilities of redefining a concept, this concept that intimately connects art with history and with, obviously, ideology. Previous speakers in the series, which started in December 2013, have included Svetlana Boym, Tom McDonough, Mabel Wilson, and Mark Rakatansky. We are thrilled that some of them are here today with us, and thank you again for your presentations, which were very inspiring. And now we are delighted to have today's speakers, which Manuel will introduce to you. So before I give the microphone to Manuel, I would like to thank the team at DIA that helps put this program together, Megan Whitco, and the Mellon Fellow Adriana Campbell, and the curatorial interns Tim Anderson and Francesca Logalvo, and my colleagues Blair Babcock, Patrick Hellman, Max Tanon, for their supporting role in realizing this program. And one last thing, please, if you could turn off your cell phones. This lecture is being recorded, and later on you can request a copy of the files if you need to. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Yasmil, and thanks everybody for coming today to this third conference in the Monuments, Monumentality, Monumentalization series. I also would like to thank the entire team that has made this possible at DIA, and the scholars and writers that spoke at the two-past session of this program, Professors Svetlana Boym, Tom McDonough, Mabel Wilson, and Mark Rakatansky. This is therefore our third edition, and the fourth will take place in June with Professors Rosalind Deutsch and writer Chris Kraus. It will be around May, and a confirmed date will be sent to all of you if you want. Before I introduce our two guest speakers, Professors Michael Taussig and W.J.T. Mitchell, I would like to say a few words about the critical goals that underlie this series of discussions at DIA. This program, Monuments, Monumentality, Monumentalization, originates in the recognition of an array of contradictory impulses at stake in the very possibility of contemporary monuments. As Mark Wigley once put it, I quote, "Anti-monumental discourses inevitably give rise to new forms of monumentality," end of quote. In other words, the search for a new monumentality, and this is obviously Siegfried Gideon's wording, is a critique of the assimilated notion of the monument and vice versa. This debate not only seems to be at the core of many artworks being produced today, and I will just mention Thomas Hirson's Gramsci Monument, curated by Yasmil Raymond, a DIA commission that foreshadowed this lecture series in many ways. But this very debate has manifested itself with insisting synchronicity since the beginning of our program. If exactly 1 year ago, Professor Tom McDonough started his presentation with a timely reference to the events unfolding in Kiev's Maidan Square as he spoke, and the overthrow of Lenin's statue as an example of contemporary iconoclasm. Today, we wake up to new protests. The last one, I think, was on Washington Square Park at 2 p.m., and rallies against racist police brutality all over the United States. Thursday night, one of these demonstrations took place on New York's Foley Square, around Lorenzo Pei's sculpture, Triumph of the Human Spirit, a monument erected in proximity to the African Burial Ground historic site to commemorate the thousands of enslaved Africans and African Americans in American history. Yet, as if the title of this work wasn't already ambiguous enough, recent media reports have avoided mentioning that this monument's unveiling ceremony on Columbus Day 2000 was saluted by boycott and protest by, among other African American activists, the sculptor Lorenzo Pais himself. It is hard to find a closer illustration of the numerous conflicts and contradictions that, as I said, underlie this program at DIA. This evening, we will hear 2 lectures, What Do Monuments Want? By Professor W.J.T. Mitchell, and Monuments Need to Do Better by Professor Michael Taussig. The consonance of these 2 titles expresses the affinity of these 2 thinkers whose work we so much admire. And it is certainly not the first time they are speaking together. In fact, they have collaborated in many occasions, and their works present many intersections, from critical revisions of commodity fetishism to redefinitions of totemism in the contemporary age, to the materialist critique of images and new analysis of iconoclasm. The grammatical mood in the titles of these evening's lectures gives you a clue on the order they will follow. We will inevitably start with the interrogative one, what do monuments want, even if Professor Taussig's Monuments Need to Do Better may not want to appear as a direct response to the question. We will see. As you all can read on the printed schedule, I hope you all have one, after Professor Mitchell's talk, we will have a 15-minute break, during which coffee, tea, and pastries will be offered, and we will then listen to Professor Taussig's lecture, followed by a panel discussion and Q&A, where all your questions will be welcome. So now, let me introduce the first speaker of the night, or the evening, by reading a few essential facts. W.J.T. Mitchell is Professor of English and Art History at the University of Chicago, a scholar and theorist of media, visual art, and literature. Mitchell is also editor of the interdisciplinary journal Critical Inquiry. He is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Guggenheim Fellowship, the College Art Association's Charles Rufus Morey Book Award, and the University of Chicago's prestigious Faculty Award for Excellence in Graduate Teaching. He is the author of What Do Pictures Want? 2005, The Last Dinosaur Book, colon The Life and Times of a Cultural Icon, 1998, Picture Theory, 94, Art and the Public Sphere, 93, and Iconology, Image Text Ideology, 1986. So please join me in welcoming Professor Mitchell at DIA.
Thanks very much. Can you all hear me at the back? Is this all right? Well, it's a great pleasure to be on the same program with Mick Taussig again. And I'm going to try to ask the question and wait and hope he provides the answers. But actually, I'm going to break with precedent and tell you what I think the answer to this question is, straight up front. And then if you have somewhere else to go, you can go do it. the desires of monuments, as opposed to the general desires of images and icons, a much larger category, the genus of which monuments are a species, monuments, I think, have very, very simple desires. That is, they just want to live forever. They don't want to die. They want to survive. They want to defeat death. And of course, this is a desire that gets projected into them, usually by their fabricators, perhaps, but usually by whatever the monument is to. And I'm going to be thinking about prepositions in relation to monuments. Why do we always use that little word, monument to something? What is the monument pointing towards? In contrast to a parallel concept and the umbrella concept of the icon, the cultural icon, the semiotic icon, which we don't say an icon is to anything. We say an icon is of something. So you might think of that as a sort of grammatical framework within which these reflections are spelled out. And I have to apologize, this is not a formal paper. It's a talk that has been scribbled in the last few hours. But it's something I've been working on for a long time, so I hope it won't be completely chaotic. So I'm going to begin with the most kind of ordinary and canonical statement about monuments from Elwha Riegel's famous 1903 essay, The Modern Cult of Monuments, Its Essence and Development. In which Riegel says, in its oldest and most original sense, a monument is a work of man erected for the specific purpose of keeping particular human deeds or destinies alive and present in the consciousness of future generations. So there it is, spelled out right away by Riegel. The idea is liveness and presence. And in this way, monuments also want to not only defeat death, they want to defeat history, because they don't want to be history. They want to be alive in the present. So they are creatures of memory. And of course, the word monument contains that as its original sense. Memory as contrasted with history. History puts things in the past. We know they're dead and gone, won't come back. But memory is where the past comes back. So the monument is this impossible project to keep the past, even the deepest past, alive and present in the present. It's also, Riegel says, the kind of keystone or key link in the developmental chain of art history. That is, art history circulates around the idea of the monument as the primary object of analysis. And Erwin Panofsky, following Riegel, said this quite clearly in his essay, The History of Art as a Humanistic Discipline. He's talking about an altarpiece from 1471, and he says, I've referred to it as a monument and to the contract that went with this altarpiece as a document. That is to say, as primary material and secondary material. So art history always has this division between the primary and secondary, which is defined by the monument. In this sense, Panofsky is following Riegel and saying every work of art counts as a monument for art history. Maybe not for the public, but certainly for the professional art historian. These are the monuments, the primary matter of study. And Panofsky goes on to say that this is true of any learned discipline, any knowledge formation. What is true of the relationship between monuments, documents, and a general historical concept in the humanities is equally true of the relationship between phenomena, instruments, and theory in the natural sciences. So it's as if this distinction, primary, secondary, monument, document, goes across all of the learned disciplines. And Panofsky goes on to say, of course, that one discipline's documents are another discipline's monuments. Literary people often look at works of visual art and treat them as documents because their emphasis is primarily on literature. And this is true with many other disciplines as well. There's always, what is in the foreground, what is in the background? The foreground is the monument, background is the document. But then Panofsky pulls the rug out from under the whole distinction by saying the documents which should explain the monuments are just as enigmatical as the monuments themselves. And before he lapses into despair over that, he says, this is what we call the hermeneutic circle, that interpretation is like a serpent chasing its own tail. And then he rescues the entire project by saying, you could call it a vicious circle, but I call it an organic situation. So don't worry, all is well. We are in an organic situation here. Monuments may want to live, they may have to die, but that's an organic situation in itself. So now I want to lay out my own theoretical armature for this based on a really fundamental question, and that's what is the difference between an icon and a monument? I'm not going to define either of them very much. I'm just going to try to think about them contrastively, and I hope in the discussion period we'll come back to this because this is very much an experimental question. You could ask, what's the difference between a monument and a piece of jewelry? That would also make sense, but I want to focus on these two relatively abstract notions, icon and monument. And just to lay out the entire argument, here it is. Icon is to monument as a species, the large category to the specimen. That is, monuments are one subclass of this amazingly various form of things we call icons, images, pictures, statues, buildings, anything that has a shape, a form, and a meaning. But the difference, the first difference that comes to mind is that images circulate rather freely. They are retained in memory. They go from one medium to another. A painting is copied by a photograph, and the photograph is remembered by a beholder. So images are immaterial entities, phantasmatic. They can cut loose from this material support. Monuments, I want to suggest, can't do that. They are stuck in the material world. They are solid. And of course, as we know, the kind of default notion of monuments is they're made of very hard matter, not soft matter, not malleable. They should be really durable and long-lasting. Steel, stone are among the favorite materials. Whereas images are evanescent. They are what is given off by the monument and that lives beyond it. There's also a contrast of mobility and fixity. Monuments belong somewhere. They are site-specific. Sometimes they are memorials over a grave, as in the funeral monument, or over a foundational site. The image that comes off the monument is highly mobile, can flash around the world, especially in the digital era, at the speed of light. We might also think about questions of scale. Monuments are generally big, whereas images, their size is completely flexible. In memory, an image can take over a consciousness completely, become an obsessive horizon of thought, or it can shrink down to something like a flash of light. And then there's the question of significance and meaning, and I think we use that word significant when say something is significant in two ways. One is, let's call it the semiotic meaning, namely significant means something means something. But we also use significant with the large S to mean something is important. Monuments are important. In fact, they always claim a kind of self-importance. And that's why it's so much fun to make fun of them and bring them down. That's why iconoclasm is such a wonderful practice. Nothing like bringing down the outsized big scale. And of course, it's occurred to me that we could invoke Jacques Lacan's distinction between the objet petit a and then the big A, the big other, and the little other, or between the spirit and ghost, or the tombstone that spirit hovers around. And finally, life and death, the monument is always, it seems to me, or almost always, maybe exceptions, a mediator between life and death, or something that's caught in the paradoxical tug and to and fro of life and death, the desire to live forever, the inevitability that the monument itself is simply dead. From a disciplinary standpoint, I think my approach, framing monuments inside of the study of images, of iconology, rather than art history, means that I'm allied with Abby Warburg's great project of a universal iconology, and not so much with the ambition of art history, which treats primary and secondary. I'm trying to, in other words, deconstruct that idea that there is a primary material and a secondary, because I think they keep shifting places even within a single discipline. So you can think of this as an essay of iconology versus art history. Now, the rest of this lecture is going to be a kind of whirlwind tour through a lot of images. And every one of them deserves a long meditation, but I don't have time to do that, so please fasten your seatbelts. Might as well begin with the obvious, with Shelley's poem Ozymandias, about the ancient tyrant whose statue is to be found in the Arabian desert. And as Shelley meditates on it, he sees that, that to the sculptor, the passions of Ozymandias, his wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command, those things are still visible. But there's also something else that's visible, and that's what Ozymandias is saying to the world, and what he said when this monument was initially erected, namely, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. And of course, when Ozymandias had those words inscribed, he was in the seat of power, and he was defying all the other tyrants in the world to compete with him, saying, look at what I've done, and there's nothing left for you but despair. But now Ozymandias himself lies in ruins thousands of years later, and the inscription changes its meaning. The significance, the big significance of the power of meaning has elapsed into a kind of minor significance, the small s, an acknowledgement that even Ozymandias would have to look on his works and despair because they're all gone, they're all in ruins. And this is, I think, the fundamental logic of the classic monument from antiquity forward. That is, it's typically a figure of the hero on the horse, a kind of favorite of public art all over Europe. Every town square has its monarch or warrior on a horse. This is Saddam Hussein at the peak of his power. But of course, not so long after Saddam Hussein in this picture. And of course, we need then to ask, well, who's pulling this guy down? It's us, it is the US. And so we know that our monuments are not guaranteed to survive forever either. We've known this at least since that wonderful day in 1968 when the first Planet of the Apes was unveiled. And it ended, you recall, with this fantastic scene, Charlton Heston galloping up the beach and falling down on his knees in despair and saying, they really did it, didn't they? What's left of the Statue of Liberty? So this is one of the key functions, I think, of monuments. It's to express power, to express the desire for immortality and eternal life, but at the very same time, to hold out the inevitability of death, the inevitability of the loss of power, the conquest of memory by history, and the conquest of, the other thing monuments all want is respect, but what they all get in the long run is disgrace. And this is still going on. As we've seen in the last few days, the Statue of Liberty herself in the New York Daily News cannot breathe. Or monuments of this sort to the founding fathers and the great presidents of the United States, here under siege from a more recent creation of U.S. military power, namely Abu Ghraib prison, and particularly an icon. I wouldn't call it a monument, although in some places in the Middle East there are now marble statues of the hooded man of Abu Ghraib. So he's maybe on his way to monumentalization. Here he is morphing in this David Rees cartoon into a transformer. He's seized being a figure of abjection and a torture victim and turned into a kind of attack airplane that is flying into the faces of Mount Rushmore. Thomas Jefferson is saying, I'm sure you can't read this, "Oh Jesus, it's headed right at us." And Jefferson is saying, literally or metaphorically, I can't turn my head. So then, of course, you knew this was coming. But what is the Washington Monument? On the one hand, and this I want to turn from the question of the sovereign, the kind of patriarchal figure of power, the Ozymandias model, to the Washington Monument. And just briefly to say, one of the important things about the meaning of the monument is that it's not just George Washington's phallus. It is also, according to the program, a kind of symbol of the collectivity and equality of the citizens of the United States, so that every stone in the Washington Monument is supposed to be a citizen. In that sense, it is a democratic monument, not a triumphal icon of superior power. You might say that it's having it both ways. And of course, this monument, like others, they always want to live forever. And this, a strange echo of the Washington Monument, repurposed for Tahrir Square during the Arab Spring. And here, instead of stone blocks identified as individual citizens, there are the names of the individual martyrs inscribed on this wooden obelisk. Also, a kind of uncanny return of the obelisk from its historical origin in Egypt. The obelisk has made its tour all the way from ancient Egypt to ancient Rome, to Paris, to the United States, and now back to Tahrir Square. And I'm sure at this moment, if not before, this monument to the martyrs of the Tahrir Square uprising, it must feel terribly ironic in the weeks when Mubarak, the murderer of most of those martyrs, has now been exonerated and is out of prison. Another familiar monument to collectivity, of course, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, about which we could talk for a long time. Again, this one begins in the era of, I think, in American art, anti-monumentality, questioning the nature of the monument, trying to come up with a different way of thinking about monuments. And therefore, it was, as you probably recall, very controversial in the 1980s when it was unveiled. People expected a triumphal memorial, but of course Vietnam was a military defeat, a terrible psychological and political defeat for the United States. So it is a kind of anti-monument, but it gathers up again the names of the fallen, and in a kind of tour de force of monumental iconography, it mingles the living and the dead because of the mirrored polished stone surface. The names of the dead are mingled with the images of the living whenever somebody visits this monument. So again, monuments generally have a collective existence, memorializing not just an individual death as in the funerary monument, but the death of, in this case, an enormous collective, but still a selective collective, since it does not include the names of the many, many more Vietnamese dead. This next image, I'm not sure it's a monument. It's Anish Kapoor's Cloud Gate, also known in Chicago popularly as the Bean, much to Anish Kapoor's irritation. And I think of this as a form of public art that appeals to public narcissism. It basically takes the effect of the Funhouse Hall of Mirrors and turns it into a civic monument, which is an incredible magnet for beholders. The Cloud Gate is almost always surrounded by crowds. And why? It isn't that they've come to look at the Bean or to look at the Cloud Gate. They've come to look at themselves. It might be seen as a monument to the selfie because you don't have to actually take a picture of yourself with your camera. You can just take a picture of yourself in the Cloud Gate along with the skyline of Chicago. It is the perfect monument of tourism. And in saying that, I'm not trying to be snarky, really, not too much anyway. It is, I think, a marvelous object. Certainly the city planners of Chicago are delighted with it because it has displaced Picasso as the kind of civic icon, the #1 public sculpture in a city that has lots of public sculpture. But I want to juxtapose it with a work of public art, a kind of monument that is at the south end of Grant Park. As far as you can go in that complex by Randolph Street on the north down to Roosevelt Road on the south. And this is the Polish sculptor Magdalena Abakanowicz' Agora, which again is a collective monument. It brings together a lot of figures in a kind of format that Michael North called the public as sculpture. A notion of the monument that was pioneered by Joseph Beuys and involves, again, treating the public itself as somehow represented or imitated by the monument. Agora, though, is a deeply melancholy and disturbing monument. For one thing, it's already suffered its kind of pre-iconoclastic decapitated. One of the favorite things for iconic practices is cutting the head off of a monument. Abakanowicz has already taken care of that. They're also all eviscerated. They are walking clothes in rusty steel. And they are also, although it's called agora, that is the Greek word for the marketplace, the gathering place of the public, they seem to be in the act of dispersing. It's as if the public has no magnetism to pull it together. So it is the exact opposite of the Anish Kapoor monument at the north end of Grant Park. And I think of these as great bookends to a marvelous space of public sculpture in our time. And needless to say, very few people make a pilgrimage to see Abakanowicz. I'm one of the few, I think, who visits there regularly. It's partly a monument also to the arrival of immigrants in Chicago. The corner of Roosevelt Road and Michigan Avenue was a place where the great migration from the south occurred. So this could be seen as the migrants arriving and milling around kind of aimlessly. Now, one of the things that Riegel said about monuments is that they are works of man. And of course, that's something we need to question. To me, arguably the most impressive monument on the planet Earth is not a work of man. It is the fantastic sandstone concretion in the middle of the Australian desert, known as Uluru by the Aborigines, called Ayers Rock by white folks. And it is a sacred site, a kind of sacred monument to the dream times, to the time of the creation of the world. If you go with an Aboriginal guide, you can walk 18 kilometers around the rock and get story after story. If you I'm not sure if you can still do this, but up till a few years ago, you could also climb up on the rock, which is regarded as taboo and forbidden by Aborigines, but was, of course, a great tourist attraction for a long time. So as far as I know, white people are still climbing up on Ayers Rock, which they shouldn't do. But this also brings me back to the issue of the materiality of monuments. I talked about their kind of durability and hardness. And it's one of the great paradoxes. If monuments want to live forever, why is it that so frequently they are made out of inanimate material? Stone is the favorite. And this idea of the foundation stone, the rock, the unmovable origin that stands for the birth of a nation, the birth of a religion, it seems to be a recurrent trope in the monument. Sometimes the monument is ridiculously small. If any of you grew up in Boston, you probably know every school child is taken on a pilgrimage to Plymouth Rock, where the pilgrims, according to legend, first stepped off the boat into North America and began to found the great American experiment. It's a rather diminutive rock, not really worthy of this huge reputation, but I put it in here partly just for the absurdity of it, that this rock is still part of elementary education for every kid in Boston, and as far as I know, all over the country. There are also sacred stones at the foundation of the world's great religions. I could show you the kind of living rock called St. Peter, which founded the Catholic Church on the basis of a pun, "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church." But Islam also, in the eastern corner of the Kaaba, you find the black stone, the kind of sacred navel of Islam, or the Dome of the Rock. Probably the most contested site on the planet today, the one that could easily launch another major war in the Middle East, in case we just were running out of wars. But I want to turn now away from these stones which have been appropriated officially as founding sites for religion, for nations, and look at a rather eccentric group of images, at least in relation to the usual treatment of monuments. And this is, again, the natural monument. In this case, a natural monument transformed into a national monument. Dinosaur National Monument in Vernal, Utah, is unique among the kind of monumentalizing of the dinosaur as an icon of American culture and of global culture. It's unique because they decided not to take the bones out of the ground, but to leave them locked in the matrix of stone. So this is the centerpiece, an entire wall of visible fossils that will never be reconstructed or reanimated in the usual way to make them into a vertical monument, the vast constructions you find at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago or the American Museum here in New York. This is just a plug for my own book on this matter, which tries to explain the mystery of the dinosaur as first a national monument, especially in this country where dinosaurs became a kind of unofficial totem animal in the 19th century and have been the subject of movies, sculptural reconstructions. A lot of artists, including Smithson, who had a lot to say about monuments, also knew a lot about dinosaurs. As you know, Smithson was a kind of paleontologist artist himself. So I thought I have one little film clip of a minute that I'm going to show you in which you get to see this monument coming back to life in, of all places, the Brooklyn Museum, in a commercial made for McDonald's French fries a few years back.
Sit up. Roll over. Good boy. Okay, here's an easy one. Play dead.
So, in order to get the full deep significance of this big, and the way the big S gets turned into the little s in this particular monument, meeting something bigger than himself in a way. McDonald's French fries must be, if there is a totem vegetable for the world, there it is. And if you think I'm stretching to call the dinosaur a totem animal, just look at these two stills from the commercial you've just seen. This is where the dinosaur's shadow and profile sort of blends with the Kwakiutl totem poles in the Brooklyn Museum. So this, it isn't just man-made artificial monuments. It's also, in a way, the dinosaur has always been a monument to big science, but also to the bigness of the U.S. You're just going to have to read my dinosaur book to get the whole story of this. But here's another moment in it that I think is very telling. As we know, when monsters come back to life, they often demand human sacrifice. And this, I think, is one of the great juxtapositions in modern cinema history between King Kong sparing the life of Fay Ray, who has been left to be sacrificed to the great god Kong, to 60 years later, Jurassic Park, where the lawyer who is working for Jurassic Park and figuring out how to evade environmental laws finally meets his match in the T-Rex, who does not spare his life but snatches him screaming off of the toilet. He's hidden in an outhouse hoping the T-Rex won't notice. So the idea that at some level the monument is something totemic, that is a symbol for a collective or community, certainly fetishistic, but even perhaps idolatrous in the sense that it demands human sacrifice, that Ozymandias, certainly, anybody who made fun of him would have been immediately killed. And the idea that we sacrifice to monumental images, I think, is a critical part of what makes them signifiers with a big S. But at a certain moment in 20th century art, and I'm not going to try to say what that moment is, I'm sure everybody here would have a different version of it, a notion of anti-monumentality began to take root. And I think the generation of Smithson was very much part of this, but also of the minimalists, and particularly Robert Morris, who began with this very simple and I think profound gesture of exhibiting a slab of plywood, gray plywood, as if the point now was to stop looking at the erect statue, the great figure of the monument, and replace it by the basis on which it stands, the plinth, the slab. Morris also, in this early period in the 70s, he was commissioned or invited to submit a proposal, rather, for a VA hospital in Florida. And he went back to another tradition of the public monument, and that's the idea of displaying obsolete weapons. You know, that in many Midwestern towns, there is a cannon on the courthouse lawn, or sometimes even a tank. So the display of weapons from the last war, I'm not sure what we're going to do with drones when it's their turn, but there will come a time when those will be the obsolete weapons replaced by something else. In any case, what Morris proposed for the VA hospital, he says, exactly what seemed correct for it, namely the casings of the atomic bombs that were dropped on Japan. The big man and little boy, these two casings. Needless to say, this proposal was rejected, and I had dinner here in the village with Morris last night, and I asked him, what did they say when they rejected it? And he said, They didn't complain about the irony, the fact that I had included with it a justification saying, as we all know, these bombs saved American lives, just like the VA hospital. So they deserve to be there. The government completely ignored that fairly transparent irony, and they said, no, we wanted you to make something. This was a found object, and so not so good. But Morris continued to reflect on this strange way, the dialectic between life and the death of monuments. In this wonderful painting, encaustic on aluminum, following the photograph of Hans Nemeth of Jackson Pollock painting. And I don't think you can read the words that run up and down the sides of this, but they say, rush, life, rush, monument, dead, monument. The idea being that Pollock's life itself was a kind of, he had a meteoric career in which his life seemed to pour out onto canvas, and then it came to an early and tragic end. And even before the end of his life, in some way, he had hit a blank wall in his art. I think every art historian knows this story. So this is what happens also to vital artistic movements in the present, and it's one reason why I think art history has constituted itself around the idea that our primary objects are monuments, and then the secondary are the documents around them. Certainly the Dia Foundation, every art museum has this sense that there's the really important sacred stuff, and then there's the stuff in the back room, in file cabinets, that tells you about the context. So that's, I want to turn from that then to the question of revolutionary monuments, since revolutions generally try to monumentalize themselves in some ways. And to me, the most moving and most accurate monument was singled out in the middle of the 19th century by the French historian Jules Michelet, when he wrote his history of the French Revolution and centered it around an empty space. And here's Michelet's statement. This is in the opening pages of his preface to the history of the French Revolution. The Champ de Mars, this is the only monument that the Revolution has left. The Empire has its column and engrosses almost exclusively the Arc of Triumph. Royalty has its Louvre, its Hospital of Invalids. The feudal church of the 12th century is still enthroned at Notre Dame. Nay, the very Romans have their imperial ruins, the Thermae of the Caesars. And the Revolution has for her monument empty space. This statement has haunted me for a long time, right down to the present moment of the Occupy movement and its moment of revolutionary enthusiasm, followed by its premature disappearance. I'm not saying, by the way, that the Occupy movement was a failure. I think it was actually a considerable success at the level of thought and consciousness, and I believe in the streets of the US right now, a version of it built around race rather than economics is emerging. But this idea that the best monument to revolution is empty space, I think is worth pondering. Can empty space be a monument? What does that mean, a tabula rasa? In a way, that's what Morris was saying with his slab, creating a revolution in art by erasing, producing a blank slate and starting over fresh. Here's the Champ de Mars, the monument, the only monument, according to Michelet, to the revolution. But more familiar to us are monuments of this sort. Tatlin's famous monument to the Third International, which is very much an architectural monument, but one that can't be lived in, one that really can't be used for much of anything except admiration, and which in its very form, I think, expresses the paradox of revolution, of building and deconstructing simultaneously, as if this dynamic structure were growing of its own accord toward a kind of pinnacle, a Tower of Babel that doesn't know where the top will be. So what has happened to that version of the monument in our day? Here's one answer by the Indian artist Vivan Sundaram, which is part of his group called the Gagawaka series, in which he has pillaged the Indian medical industry. As you may know, medical tourism is now one of the biggest growth industries in India. People going there to get special surgeries, plastic surgery at cut rates and in very dangerous conditions. So a lot of people are coming, and this model is basically wearing orthopedic supports, bags for various bodily fluids, but on her back, she is carrying a backpack of Tatlin's memorial. Or another echo of Tatlin in our time, Tanya Bruguera's wonderful performance piece at the Tate Modern, in which she brought in heroes on horseback, the British police, to herd the crowd in the Tate Modern's Turbine Hall. This piece is called Tatlin's Whisper, and we could spend a lot of time figuring out what is meant by that. What is this? Is this a kind of reduction of the grand ambitions of the revolution to a whisper in the face of the police overpowering crowds? As we know, this has happened all over America during the Occupy movement. It happened with a much bigger vengeance in Tahrir Square and throughout the Arab world, where the state felt incredibly endangered by peaceful demonstrations, by gatherings of citizens, and so set about to disperse them. Bruguera was also echoing the notorious behavior of the British police and army during the miners' strike under Thatcher, when they dispersed the miners violently by charging them with cavalry. So now I'm going to conclude with what I think of as not just ironic monuments, but a new model that I would call the modest monument. And maybe this will lead into mixed reflections on how we might make monuments better. These are a set of handmade shoeshine stands by my colleague at the University of Chicago, Theastra Gates. Theastra and I are teaching a course together this fall called Art and Public Life, and the main subject has not been his work at all, but the prospects for public art in our time, and particularly that form of art that's now called art as social practice, art that goes into neighborhoods, that works with communities, that is often indistinguishable from urban renewal, and which has modest monuments like this. These shoeshine stands, you'll notice, are a little too big. They were first displayed in Basel, Miami in 2009, and they were the props for a performance in which people could get their shoes shined by the artist. And they are, in my view, a kind of monument to white supremacy, but a vanishing monument. The whites are no longer there. There's something embarrassing about them. There's also something kind of teasing about the fabricated character of them. They're all made out of recycled lumber and other materials from demolished houses on the south side of Chicago. Or this kind of monumental object entitled Race Riots, which are nothing but fire hoses framed inside of frames from recycled materials. In this case, lath. In this case, the flashing or roofing copper. Gates's background, before he became a potter, he was a roofer. So his career as a teenager, long before he thought of being an artist, was basically restoring damaged buildings, putting the roof back on, protecting it from rain. But these fire hoses, of course, are for the black community icons of crowd dispersal, just like the horses in Tanya Bruguera's Tatlin's Whisper. They signify that moment of the civil rights era when crowds could be dispersed with fire hoses. So the fire truck goes along with that. Since you might not have a hydrant nearby, you bring a fire truck in to disperse the crowd. And this one, Gates has smeared with this 1969 Hahn fire truck with tar, his favorite roofing substance. Or at the White Cube Gallery in London, he levitated a fire engine, calling this piece Raising Goliath. And certainly the whole story of Goliath and David has to be part of what makes monuments so interesting, since they always play the role of Goliath. In this case, it gets levitated in a new way. Or my final example, this bank building on Stony Island Avenue, the south side of Chicago, which Theaster persuaded the mayor of Chicago on the day the bulldozers were lined up to tear it down, persuaded the mayor to sell it to him for $1, because it was absolutely worthless. He said, it's going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to destroy it. Sell it to me for $1 and I will restore it. Of course, it is a monument, a several generation monument to capitalism. Another restoration that Gates has made on the south side is an old currency exchange, which he has turned into a cafe. A cafe, of course, is the kind of prime location of what Habermas called the public sphere, a place of exchange of ideas and opinions. The cafe is still called the currency exchange, and it's a kind of refunctioning of the very idea, because as you know, currency exchanges in black neighborhoods are basically rip-off joints. They charge you 10% to cash a paycheck. So what is Gates doing with something like this? Certainly there is a monumentality to this bank. It is a temple to capitalism. He's restoring it, leveraging, as he says, white gilt, which turns into white gelt. And the building is about half restored now. It has a new roof. It won't fall down. And the interior is being restructured as a gallery, studios, a library and archive, and a community center for the South Side. It's not monumental, I think, in the old sense. It is monumental in a new sense, exploiting, and I think pointing to the difference between two kinds of related concepts. One is a relation of race and racism. Gates is among those artists who wants to suggest we're not in a post-racial era. If we need any more evidence, I guess the Daily Paper would tell us that. Certainly not in a post-racist era. But then what do you do with the concept of race? Gates's view is that you leverage it. You make it into an instrument for the production of wealth for those who've been the subject of racism. So the currency exchange, transforming it from a place of exploitation to a place of sociability, or the Ravenswood Bank, turning it into a place of artistic commerce, of cultural creation, rather than a place of exploitation. So our conclusion to our final class the other day was a discussion about the relation, an analogy between these four abstractions: race and racism on the one hand, and capital and capitalism on the other. For a long time, I think artists have been carrying around, they've been haunted by Tatlin's memorial. The idea of a revolutionary art, a critical art, an art that would be politically efficacious, haunts the art world. And it is, I think, a kind of ghost of a monument to revolution. But suppose the real monument to revolution was Michelet's Empty Space. And suppose there were another kind of revolution that did not treat capital as the enemy, but capitalism as the enemy. That would be the kind of monument, I think, that's being explored by my dear friend and colleague, Theaster Gates. So let me stop there and let's go have a drink.
So I will right away introduce our second speaker of the night, Professor Michael Taussig. Michael Taussig is Professor of Anthropology at Columbia University and at the European Graduate School, an innovative voice in cultural anthropology. Taussig combines aspects of ethnography, storytelling, and social theory in his work. His most recent publication, What Color is the Sacred, 2009, uses color to explore the body and conscious in an age of global warming. Other books include, among many, My Cocaine Museum, 2004, and Mimesis and Alterity, Particular History of the Senses, back in 1993, and in the gap there have been many, many other publications, and many of you have seen most of them, I'm sure. He has written essays about the work of artists Jimmy Durham and Juan Downey, and has recently given talks at the Tate Modern, London, the Museum of Modern Art, New York, and Documenta, which I believe was with Tom Mitchell. So again, please help me welcome Michael Taussig to DIA.
Good evening, and thanks for coming, despite the rain. I have really had so many old friends in an audience. It's quite wonderful. People I haven't seen for 2 or 3 years on some occasions. And I was so grateful to Tom's talk because he, in such a persuasive, charming, sophisticated way, laid out such a panorama of monuments and, perhaps more important, of ways of questioning and thinking about them. I wanted to take up one mysterious part of the talk, which is so seductive, and that is the empty space of Jules Michelet as the fitting monument, non-monument, anti-monument of the revolution. A revolution, by the way, that was totally full of symbols and leap back into history, as Benjamin and others have pointed out. The French Revolution. The empty space that I will be mainly thinking about is anything but empty. It looks empty, but it's tortured, it's writhing. It's what Foucault, following Bataille, referred to as like a flash of lightning that illuminates the darkness of the sky and so forth. It's the space of suspension of taboo. The suspension of the old regime. It's an emptiness which is crackling with its own emptiness. That's a sort of motif. I also want to say I'm interested in the question of does power need to come down in order to maintain itself? It sounds ridiculous, it sounds too much of a clever paradox, but in the monument I discern this big toe phenomenon of Bataille, the need for the heights to descend into the base, into the depths, and then move back up again in an irreconcilable play of up and down, of spirit and matter, and so forth. It was his way of combining Marx with Hegel and Nietzsche. Anyway, those are some of the themes that will occur in my talk, which is much more, how should I put it, almost ethnographic and single case oriented than what Tom did. And so I like to think of, I'm just adding another example to his. And as for me, coming up with what could monuments, how could they be bettered? What should they do? I can only think of I know this will sound a little absurd to the art historians amongst you, the students of art, and that is try and make one. And I've always felt, no matter if you are an artist or not, that if you sit down the process, if you really have to think with your scissors and paper or mud or whatever it might be, well, what would I do? How would I do this? Then you move into a practice, you move into a craft or pseudo-craft, and the answers will come that way more than any other. Now, the title of my little talk, Monuments Need to Do Better, comes from a statement basically put forth by Robert Musil in Vienna in the 30s. He addressed monuments as if they were naughty children, and he urged them to learn a lesson or two from advertising, or as we might put it today, from Wall Street. Straight away, Musil was taken with the notion that monuments are not only invisible, which is an interesting, a fascinating idea, and once it's stated, it's one of those things which are so obvious, but they need to be stated in order to be obvious. You wonder how come people make them. Would monuments be made if the monument makers and the people who pay for them and the city fathers who had read Musil that nobody will look at your monument until it is defaced, until something happens to the monument, and then all sorts of hue and cry occur. He regarded monuments, when I say he regarded, he's playing a game, he's performing, right? He's quite a prankster, Robert. He refers to monuments as sort of saturated with conspicuous inconspicuousness. And this is the result of an active force emitted by monuments that prevents us noticing them. Now, Tom's talk was based or assumed much about the life of monuments. He's sort of taking this animism very seriously, starting with the title of his talk. And this is what Musil is doing too. He's assuming that monuments are alive and they are playing a game of being dead. Their being is to be non-being, to be invisible. Like animals in the jungle, monuments have worked out a way of camouflaging themselves, which, when you think of it, is quite an achievement. Given that the state and state religions, since Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt with its obelisks and pyramids, has had such a profound and profoundly magical investment in building vertical structures in the hardest possible materials, the higher, the better. Now, such stately monumentation is likely to be soaked in war and the dead, especially dead soldiers involved in the founding violence of the state, and hence its laws and its police. It is from the dead in general that not only monuments but the state draws its magic, which is the magic of sacrifice, and with soldiers and the populace taking the place of the sacrificial ram or the sacrifice of Jesus. The complement to this is the Arch of Triumph, which of course is very old, a very old conception, at least since Rome. And it's the first example of Arnold von Gennep's, in his influential book, Rites of Passage, 1909. Gennep's idea being you enter the Arch of Triumph as one type of being, and you emerge as completely different. Now there's a monument for you. Not just something you look at, but perform with. In the West, Christianity took over the monument building from Rome, late Rome, for a millennium at least. But as Nietzsche made much of, submission and humility was a greater weapon than the warrior and the warrior ethos. And anyway, the church was a mighty secular as well as a religious power hungry for monumentation as its essential narrative, But so what? What are we to make of Musil's invisibility of monuments? Why are they so bashful or indifferent or even secretive? A monument that clearly underlies the nation state is Carabobo, on a flat concreted plain the size of an airfield in Venezuela, outside of the cities, built by the legendary dictator José Vicente Gómez in 1921. To celebrate 100 years of the decisive battle of the Wars of Independence from Spain in 1821. You proceed along an avenue of busts of famous generals on either side, and then through the Arch of Triumph, with the tomb to the unknown soldier as a slab on the ground, protected by soldiers, in 1820s uniform to then witness further on a mountain of dead corpses in stone or in bronze, I can't remember, atop of which are rearing horses and, of course, Simon Bolivar. So you've got the walk through the arch of, you walk through these busts of the famous generals of the Wars of Independence. You then walk through the Arch of Triumph. You walk by the side of the tomb to the unknown soldier, and there in the background is this mountain of dead, on top of which are leaping horses and Simon Bolivar. One of the busts, only one, is of a foot soldier known as Pedro Felipe. Some 50 miles away lies the magic mountain of Sorte, to which flock pilgrims seeking relief from misfortune. While neither official nor, strictly speaking, illegal, the mountain exists, I guess, in this empty space. It exists as a no man's land in the land of spirits. It is widely considered a scary and dangerous place where rapes, mugging, and murder can occur. The Magic Mountain, 50 miles from the official monument, right? But the predominant fear, I think, is diffuse and miasmatic, a mix of attraction and repulsion, a phrase you've no doubt heard before, attraction and repulsion towards the magical power of the dead. Principally of that founding violence, that state founding violence, anti-colonial war violence, monumentalized in the state-endorsed monument at Carabobo. Only at the Magic Mountain, it is rare to find white generals whose place is now taken by common foot soldiers, Indians and blacks, as plaster of Paris busts and figurines whose images are to be found in colour in the school history textbooks issued by the state. Lenin is said that he was, as far as I understand, against monuments. He wanted people's monuments. He wanted people to make statues out of plaster of Paris. Well, he should have, Venezuela popular culture has certainly come through with these plaster of Paris figurines. These spirits will possess the bodies of the healer, who in trance at the mountain, blessed with this power, undertake through ritual to relieve the pilgrim of his or her agony. Through a curious defacement amounting to an appropriation, the official monument is being milked of its latent magic. This is why I think this is an incredibly fascinating example for us, thinking about the magical potential in monuments. Nothing approaches the scale or the concreteness of what I'm telling you about here. I mean, it's very rare, but this is a model with which to think. Through a curious defacement amounting to an appropriation, the official monument is being milked of its latent magic. Or is it the other way around? Does the official monument draw its force from what is a much more, how shall I put it, basic, quasi-universal force in the everyday life of ordinary people? It's a circle. It's like Tom's vicious circle. The stiff, authoritarian, taboo-riddled official monument is transformed into ductile, do-it-yourself series of magical icons translating, not negating, translating the magical power of the state in which history and metaphor become incarnated in one vast circulation of magical powers throughout the nation state, involving not only the dead, but the children of the state as well. In fact, I sort of see this yin-yang thing between the dead and the children as absolutely crucial. And this is a 19th century drawing on a fan, which sort of expresses much of what I've been saying. This is in when Chavez was alive and president of Venezuela. I want to draw your attention to not only to the children, but the link between Bolivar and Chavez. The cult of Bolivar was enhanced greatly, not by, or Chavez sort of clung to the cult of Simón Bolívar, the magic of Simón Bolívar, the magic of the state expressed in Bolívar, and the children. But the enormity of the scale of the painting is what really is staggering to me. I can't explain everything. You have a sort of a imageric sense of endorsing what I've just been talking about. In the Magic Mountain, people come situated in front of shrines. Here's a healer helping someone whose marriage is on the rocks, and she lies there and in trance, and then the husband, who's not present, his outline is made in chalk, and so they proceed up the mountain, up the river, to the palace of Simón Bolívar. Now, Tom has shown us a great number of very polished and extremely clever monuments. This is, of course, of a completely different sort. This is something that grows sort of organically outside of that realm, borrows from it, and as I said, is part of, I think, of that circle, which feeds back into the official discourses. I thought this was one of the greatest, most interesting monuments I could ever conceive of. The Palace of Simón Bolívar on top of a large rock with the flag, and you see the candles burning to various icons. You have to ascend by a ladder. And this is more or less at the top of this mountain. I call it a mountain. It's really more like a hill. In this place, people lie in ever more baroque, ever more kitschy ritualizations with flame, and become absorbed by the various spirits of the school textbooks and Carabobo, the official monument. One thing that Tom mentioned, and I have other images to show you, is the importance of nature in such monumentation. As you work your way up the mountain, so you're always crossing streams and rivers and rocks and bushes and so forth. It's as if it's the utter perfection of a monument to the state, in which the human historical heroes fuse with the earth itself. Now, be it noted that in many, if not most, societies of hunters and gatherers, monumentalization operates very differently in what could be called an anti-monumentalizing style, which, amongst other things, involves humble materials like wood, which rots, or body paint, which flashes with dance and song, and is then no more. But in fact, referring to Musil once again, there seems to be a profound process of invisibilization at work here too. But it is one based on an active, anti-memory, anti-memorialization process that involves the banishing of the dead, along with the destruction of their house and goods and taboos on mentioning their name or showing photographs or videos of them. You see how Western I am, or Western we are. I mean, this just seems so completely against the grain. Someone dies, they're gone. You don't mention their name. You're certainly not going to have any photographs or images of them. I mean, shocking. But something grand is at work here too, which is the leap through eons of time to the origin of things. The land especially, which in Australia might go under the name of Dreamtime, and in the Trobriand Islands, just north of Australia, is also engraved in landscape. These are just areas that I know. That's why I mention them. They're not exceptional. I presume there's almost an infinite number of similar instances. Are not these desert sands, waterholes, and mountains monuments too? Enclaves of stories brought magically in the present from those other times, thanks to poetry, song, and dance. Walter Benjamin interpreted the Baroque as expressing tragedy in the petrification, or at least time out of time, of landscape. The petrifaction of landscape. Tragedy is expressed in a stilling of history into landscape. A point well taken by Danny Caravan in his memorial to Benjamin by the side of the Catholic cemetery at Port Boo. That's an artist's rendition. If some German artists have said that all monuments, even those made to memorialize the Holocaust, are fascist, or potentially so, we might do well to ponder these other forms of monumentalization, objectified in things and the dancing body and voice. But it seems that the white man's monument only rarely escapes the rigidity and permanence of bronze, marble, granite, stone, or steel, except for this marvelous memorial to Benjamin at Port Boo. Is that the function of the horse? It's like you scripted me. Is that the function of the horse? To escape from bronze and steel and all those other things I just mentioned. These are the horses on top of the dead at Carabobo. And then there's this one. We'll come back. It seems that monuments shed their invisibility when defaced. This little fella is on the base of a monument called Joie de Vivre, which is in the southeast corner of Zuccotti Park, and it was stuck there during Occupy Wall Street. Again, the scale is interesting. This is a 50-foot high piece of steel, and this is about, 2 inches in size. Previous energies that the monument devoted to not existing, to being invisible, seem to are now transformed into an intense presencing. An intense presencing, as if the monument has not only come alive, acquiring new meanings, but propels, in addition, a contagion of other defacements, like a lit fuse running through many domains. Counter-defacements, protests, police violence, letters to the editor, and so forth, all taking advantage of the licensed transgression that the unlicensed transgression opens up. I have to get something. I've been particularly struck by the way if certain monuments are defaced physically, like a limb is taken off or a foot is taken off, head is sawn off and so forth, that the malformed monument requires a certain sort of a mixture of malevolence, and pity on the part of spectators, and in certain cases can lead to counter defacements and a use of ribald language and incredible sort of violence can exist between people. And when the statue is defaced to a severe extent, there's a feeling, I think, of a queasy abjectness, and the destroyed or semi-destroyed statue has to be removed, taken from sight. What is more, defacement creates a sort of a negative energy. And I was thinking very much of the burning of the flag, the US flag, which Supreme Court judgment came out in as follows. Both Congress and the states have enacted numerous laws regulating misuse of the American flag. Until 1967, Congress left the regulation of misuse of the flag up to the states. Now, however, Title 18 U.S.C. jigga provides that, quote, whoever knowingly casts contempt upon any flag of the United States by publicly mutilating, defacing, defiling, burning, or trampling upon it shall be fined not more than $1,000 or imprisoned for not more than 1 year, or both. That was in 1967. Moreover, continuing the quote, the judgment, Johnson was prosecuted because he knew that his politically charged expression would cause serious offence. If he had burned the flag as a means of disposing of it, or because it was dirty or torn, he would not have been convicted of flag desecration under the Texas law. Federal law designates burning as the preferred means of disposing of a flag, etc., etc. Chief Justice Rehnquist, writing for the dissenting opinion in favour of prosecution, claimed that Johnson's act could not be construed as symbolic speech and thus was not protected by the First Amendment. Quote, flag burning, he said, is the equivalent of an inarticulate grunt or roar. What I'm very taken with is the sense of unease, dis-ease, that desecration of the flag or desecration of a monument can create. The word desecration means that it requires an augmented sacred quality, but what we might call a negative sacred quality. And the word desecration, of course, resonates with the secret and with secretion, underlying or reinforcing my sense of how one act of defacement is likely to create a contagious wave. One enormous example that is so obvious that you can't see it would be 9/11, the airplanes flying into the World Trade Center unleashed a series of negative sacred acts, feelings, which, as you well know, the White House and the politicians and I suppose a majority of the population were able to march into the Middle East, and therein lies where the situation we have right now. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the suspension of the taboo. In anthropological classics, meaning the lectures of Marcel Mauss in Paris in the 1920s, the students wrote down, he said, taboos exist in order to be broken. And another bon mot was, transgression merely suspends the taboo. This is the awful feeling you have if you transgress, especially as a teenager. You somehow are seen to be actually reinforcing that which you transgressed against. Is it I'm so taken with the pleasure so many people feel, not so much in transgression, which they might, but rather people feel happy in the knowledge that transgression is ephemeral, superficial, and merely suspends the taboo, quote unquote. But contrary to that, it seems to me that the space opened up by the transgression of the taboo is not so easily dispensed with. It's a fascinating space, and that is what I go back to the empty space of the Champ de Mars or the Jules Michelet example. It's that space that I would think that, how shall I put it, I get sick of the notion of an anti-monument. We've got to do better than that. But for the moment, I'll stick with it. Our anti-monumental desires would do well to explore this space that is opened up by the suspension of the taboo. Bataille, when Foucault writes the introduction to Bataille's collected works, he makes this into a very big deal. They direct us to what Benjamin called the now time, the nunc stans, of the heterogeneous time, opened up, even if only momentarily, by iconoclasm. Along with Bataille, Foucault thinks language fails us at this time. But he himself becomes positively rhapsodic at this incapacity to speak and lets fly with a torrent of heightened language that's in this space, right? The taboo is suspended. The master said it collapses back into the norm. But hey, let's keep it open a bit and let's start thinking about what's going on in that space. Foucault says it's beyond language, but he finds a language. So straight away we're faced with one interesting paradox. His language is, in my terms, a lyrical hysteria in which the very impossibility of speaking makes the speaker redouble his or her efforts to express what is happening, but the meaning keeps slipping through your fingers as if each step is a step of rupture or of breaking the taboo results in yet another taboo, and the effort multiplies, feeding on itself. So that's interesting, feeding on itself. Hence we hear from Foucault a lot about spirals rather than breaks or ruptures. Not so much the breaking or the rupture of the taboo, the spiraling activity. Quote, "The form of a spiral which no simple infraction can break." The form of a spiral which no simple infraction can break. We hear of circles too from Foucault, but not your smooth circle. Instead it is a circle made of, quote, "fissures, abrupt descents, and broken contours. It is a misshapen and crag-like language, folded back on itself and continuously questioning its limits." Then there are the cosmic and meteorological metaphors in which iconoclasm is likened, quote, "to the solar inversion of satanic denial." Or, quote, "to a flash of lightning in the night, which from the beginning of time gives a dense and black intensity to the night it denies, yet owes to the night the stark clarity of its manifestation." In the late 1930s, Bataille and the Acéphale, the headless group, planned to sacrifice someone by a tree hit by lightning just outside of Paris, but chickened out. Roger Calvat was meant to be the victim. Quote, "On marshy soil in the centre of a forest where turmoil seems to have intervened in the usual order of things stands a tree struck by lightning. One can recognize in this tree the mute presence of that which is assumed the name of Acéphale, expressed here by these arms without a head." Why would mutilated, lightning-struck, headless trees seem appropriate for such consecration? Why are such trees engraved in the psyche of monumentalities? People struck by lightning in southern Mexico have to seek out a healer who's also been struck, and it'd often be, in my experience, by a tree such as this. Is there something in the monument, is my next question, which impels its abjection and defacement? Now, this is a very leading question. This is a sort of forced question. This is not commonsensical, I suppose. Does power have to descend in order to rise? Is a monument, any monument, in other words, asking for it? My example here would be the monument of the big toe in Bataille's 1930-31 essay, in which he makes a monument of the human body. Most of those essays of his are in the late 20s and early 30s are actually what Alan Stoichel calls a de-allegorization of the human body. You could also think of them, and this is a footnote, de-allegorization of the human body in relation to the sun, because many of the essays are about the sun, formidably so, the solar anus, the pineal eye, and so forth. But we'll leave the sun for another day. I think it's important to think of the body as a monument, and Bataille, sort of tongue-in-cheek, asks us to contemplate what he calls the ugliness, the absurdity of the big toe. That serves for him as a, shall we say, the entry point into thinking about the relationship between the head, the genitals, the head, and the big toe. And he goes back up and down this sort of escalator moving between Hegel and Marx and Nietzsche, and ends up pointing out that the base has its own metaphysic, just like the head, the elevation of spiritual values with the head, with art and philosophy and so forth, logical thinking, depends upon something as base as the foot and the big toe mired in the mud. And he has a lot of enjoyment. He has a lot of iconoclastic enjoyment in not only showing this dependency of the head on the base, but in showing you the impossibility, he thinks, of getting out of this continual movement between the head and the foot. In this way, he uses Hegel to sort of, how shall I put it, refurbish Marxism, and uses Marxism to refurbish Hegel. But it's the end of the essay, which I wanted to point to, which is having dealt with this vertical movement of up and down and up and down, he then turns to the movement of the sounds of the intestines, which are rotating and circular. And he says a quite florid paragraph where he sort of invites you to think about that picture and those sorts of sounds that the borgorigami, I think they're called in medical terms, the intestines are capable of. So it's this movement between the vertical and the circular that I want to draw attention. And the circularity within the human body, as he pictures it for us, is the sign of the impossibility of resolving this contradiction between the above and the below. So I want to ask now, is there a strategy opened up by this Bataille Foucault zone of suspension, a way of, I don't know how to put this, holding it tight in a loving embrace so it doesn't evaporate or collapse into the status quo? Here we might return to the so-called primitive societies of the Americas. But within the history of colonialism, you could do the same for Australia. because the example I gave before, the Trobrians, the deserts and so forth, that's a sort of taken time out of time. That's in a perfect, pre-colonial world. But I'm now much more interested in that within the present contemporary world. I once went with I don't like the term much, but I go with a shaman from Colombia to Machu Picchu in Peru. That's a long way. And he's in his 70s, and he was with his assistant, and we had he's heals with hallucinogens, and we had lots of adventures along the way. And a peak part of this trip for me was visiting the great Incan ruins of Machu Picchu, which people like poets like Pablo Neruda and so on have esteemed so highly. And on the train, getting there from Cusco, and then you go climb up the hill. There's a little bus, I think. There were hardly any tourists in those days. That was 1983. There was a newspaper article. Well, they come out, I think, once a year. Yet another Peruvian archaeologist to solve the problem of how the Incas were able to move such massive stones to make the monument of Machu Picchu, which is now a monument. It's ruins, but it was a fortress before in the pre-colonial times. So everything's very quiet up there, very, very quiet, shattering blue sky, these incredible stone shapes, ruins of houses and circular shapes and so forth. But my friend Santiago Motumbahoy said nothing. And I was very disappointed. And so I sort of egged him on and said, well, isn't this fantastic? What do you think about this? Come all the way from Colombia, from the jungles of Colombia. Never left those jungles in the Putumayo. And he said, oh, I've seen it all before. I said, what are you talking about? He said, yeah, taking the medicines, the hallucinogenic medicines, I've seen it before. So my heart swelled. I thought, oh my God, this is so fabulous, this Pan-American Indian soul. It's all connected, Machu Picchu, Colombia, hallucinogens and so forth. Then there's another pause. He doesn't say anything, gets me really quite pissed off. So I remember the article in the newspaper and I say, well, how do you think they built this thing? And he looks at me in a slightly scathing way and says, the Spanish built it. I said, what are you talking about? He said, yeah, the Spanish were real motherfuckers, and they whipped the Indians to carry these stones and built this monument. Well, so he said, like when my father-in-law was accused by another Indian of being a witch, the priests, as punishment, made him carry stones to build the church. And you would see them walking along the path, the father with a stone, the mother with a stone, and every little kids with their stones. Well, that's unintended iconoclasm, and of a very high degree. That, to me, he made Machu Picchu into the most marvelous anti-monument. And to get the full irony of it, you must understand that the Peruvian state celebrates these monuments, of course, while on the other hand, the racism against indigenous people is intense. And I'm sure those of you who've traveled have experienced that contradiction. I wanted to mention a little bit the artwork of Jimmy Durham. I wanted to start off with this self-portrait, or I call it a self-portrait, in which the stone is all important. And of course it's a very delicate balance, a very delicate dance, I think, that Jimmy performs in between being an artist and between being a Native American artist. And to negotiate that space is very, very difficult and very, very delicate, okay? So this stone is also in the shape of some stone tool, pre-colonial tool. It's just there. You've got to figure it out yourself if you want to go that way. the police trestle is important in that it brings into question the sorts of events we're seeing now in the last 2 or 3 days. And there's just a touch, if you like, but a very significant touch of the Native American world, just put together and mixed like that. On the stones that I and Tom have been talking about quite a bit, here's this work in this, what I think of as the space of transgression, in which tiny little stones are stuck with glue onto a piece of cardboard. The artist has written people's names underneath each one, like Esmeralda, for instance. And again, the scale seems so significant. The misshapen, irregular shape of the stones is also of great significance here. It's a way of, how should I put it, bringing the stones down to earth. Jimmy once told me that he always wanted to go and visit some quarry, I think it was Sweden, and where a lot of the marble or granite was being excavated for Nazi monuments, and he wanted to put some of the slabs onto a barge, take it across the Baltic, and then sink the barge. That's, you know, that's Jimmy for you. I wanted to draw attention to this type of guillotine. You have another chance, and work with the ironies of that. But it reminds me of a work of his I've never seen, which is a mobile Arch of Triumph. So whenever you've had a triumph, according to the artist, you can get out your little collapsible Arch of Triumph and walk through it. So this is the same sort of level of comedy and irony. One of the things that Jimmy, who loves horses, mentioned after listening to or hearing about all the equestrian statues, we heard a fair bit about that today already, equestrian statues in the southwest of the United States, was saying, well, it was two things that are disconnected, I suppose. One was, you know, who will be surviving in 500 years in the United States? Do you think the white man's got much of a chance, sort of idea? Put that on one side. His idea was to build an elevated sort of serpentine freeway running 300 or 400 miles along the Mexican-American border, and have elevated, a bit like my drawing of Carabobo, have elevated statues of famous people on horses. So you can drive along this freeway, which is 200 or 300 feet in the air, and look to your left and look to your right. And he thought that would be a fine work of art. Now, speaking of horses, I want to go back to my horse that I showed you previously. This horse I found in a police station in Venezuela. I found it a very disturbing image, and I'm never quite sure why. Who is in charge, the diminutive rider or the massive horse? This, of course, is Simón Bolívar. The man seems to be sinking into the animal such that the brute instinct becomes enshrined. The crudity of the drawing seems deliberate. There are plenty of great drawers around. And after all, the usual official icon could have been used instead. The crudity suggests an attitude towards representation itself. Perhaps the very crudity gets us closer to understanding what Walter Benjamin, in his essay on the legal theory of the modern state, referred to as the spectral being of the police in democracies. Spectral on account of the way the police occupy and take advantage of a sort of no man's land of violence between the making and the execution of law. Is it not a scary image? In part, this could be because of its strategic incompleteness, because the painter, so the police say, has yet to finish his job, as if one day the crudity will be absolved in a figure of sublime perfection. Bataille's head. But is not this very unfinishedness the empowering sign of the diffuse, never-endingness of ramifying mediation of the official and the unofficial, which is exactly where policing lies, as does the relationship between the official monument at Carabobo and the Magic Mountain. Horses are wonderfully appropriate to monuments. For a life on the go, for the new class of mobile monuments that copy equestrian stately monuments. Here I'm thinking of one of Tom's last images in the Tate Modern of the horses used for crowd control. The way the horses of the conquistadores were replaced by the helicopters in Korea and Vietnam, the airborne cavalry, as we saw in the movie Apocalypse Now. And also, I think, in police riot gear, which you may think I'm stretching things, but I see this as exceedingly monumental. It's only in the last couple of years that I myself have been made aware of this gear. I think in Colombia was the first time I saw it in action. These are peasants trying to get their land back in northern Colombia. So maybe I have to beg your indulgence, but what I'm interested in now is the horse, the equestrian monument, the horse giving or suggesting mobility. These new forms of monumentation are mobile like horses. And I wanted to think of the SWAT team and the SWAT vehicles as part of this new mobility of the stately monument. What caught my eye, I may have a strange eye, is how stupid this looks, how actually comic it looks. And that would take us into another discussion about the way in which power so often lends itself to absurdity and the comic. This is an important point because it's so easy to be petrified and scared by the arms and armature of the state. Finally, I want to come back because it's so powerful and so prevalent to another form, which is what I'll call the hands-up monument. Is it stretching things too much? To think of this as our contemporary mobile monument? So I'll finish there and open up for discussion. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Mick. Thanks, Tom, for these incredible lectures. Thank you so much. Perfect. I feel completely hyperactive after this. So I have a bunch of papers. But I think there will be many questions, and I think everybody is really fascinated by all the things you said. So I will just concentrate on one question I think sort of pervades or goes through both your presentations, and I will try to locate the question in the concepts of animation and performance. I have the feeling that at many moments in both your talks, you were addressing this idea of performance, either performing the monument or the monument itself as a performative object, even as an animated object. I think it was quite obvious in the McDonald's clip that Tom Mitchell showed us, Professor Mitchell, but I think we saw it quite clearly when Professor Taussig, you were going from the Arc de Triomphe and the act of going through the Arc de Triomphe to speak about Jimmy Durham and his mobile Arc de Triomphe, and then also this brings me back to the Planet of the Apes and this thrill of seeing the Statue of Liberty displaced or moved, but at the same time it's like the monument itself did something, or there was some sort of performance that happened to it. So in a way, I feel if the monument is not performed in the revolutionary way, which I also think it's another of the windows of this chain of thought, how the monument is enacted by the revolutionary forces, how the revolutionary forces themselves are monumental. If not, then there is a whole fantasy of the monument being activated in multiple ways, through fiction, through, I don't know, dreams, trauma. So I would like you both to explore this idea of animation and performance perhaps a little more. I don't know.
Well, Tom started it off, I think, with the notion of what do pictures want. So immediately he found, as in my opinion, an intellectual vantage point, a creative launching pad by an as-if, a big as-if, an assumption. Well, these paintings look, they're objects, they're images, as he went through the list. Let's think of them as having desires, which are not necessarily my desires or the desires of the spectators, but taking very seriously this type of animation. And then he's sort of bridged the gap by applying the same sort of heuristic device to monuments of steel and stone and so forth. In my and so he should talk about the animation part. He's actually read a lot about what is life and all this newfangled questions, maybe post-Foucauldian ones with biopower and so forth, but that's for eggheads, not necessarily me or us in large. My interest in the animation came very much from this my experiences with this official monument in Venezuela, and seeing people showed us milking this latent magic. And what's so interesting to me is how willy-nilly, let's say, this abstraction called the state and the artists who work for the state and the committees and the subcommittees and all this complicated bureaucracy, which is you'd think is capable not of thinking, enjoy a legacy of creativity in which there's something that in an age of enlightenment cannot be called magic, cannot be called animism, right? But it's there, and they play with it. But the official voice is, only very vulgar, common people would ever assume what we're really saying. And it's picked up. And I'm not saying that this common voice, this common people, are revolutionary or anything. Heaven help, no. That would be such a adolescent assumption to make. This is magic for curing depression, for curing unemployment, for curing a bad marriage, and so forth and so on. There's nothing inherently revolutionary in it. So please don't get the idea that I'm opposing the common people to the state. What's fascinating is the different degrees of abstraction. The official language is the spirit of Bolivar. Well, you and I know that's a metaphor, right? Well, is it? What does a metaphor rest upon?
Well, as usual, a lot of my thinking is actually inspired by Mick's writing, particularly this very simple notion that, as he said, that the monument is invisible, but also inert most of the time. It's just there. All these heroes on horses, these cannons and tanks on courthouse lawns, just stand there until a performance surrounds them. And that can be something incredibly simple. Putting a mustache on the Mona Lisa. Suddenly, she starts to look at you in a different way. And the act of defacement. Mick says somewhere that an image is never so much alive as when somebody tries to kill it. It's that moment when life and death come together, that moment of defacement. I think that a lot of counter-monumental and anti-monumental practice in our time has started from this notion that you don't just make a different object. The task for artists is not just, okay, let's make something new, different. That was the modernist impulse. But to make something that strips things away and then to accompany it with a performance. Morris's slabs and beams were all props. Remember, Michael Fried complained that they were too theatrical because it was as if the beholder was somehow called out or disturbed by the presence of these objects. And of course, Morris and his generation did that again and again. It didn't just make objects, but made performances around them to reactivate them or make them come alive in a different way. So I think it's an essential question, Manuel. The question beyond the question is, how many ways can this be done? What is the meaning of these practices? When do they feel timely or untimely? And why? I totally agree with Mick that the hands up sign and the I can't breathe, the laying down and pretending to die, that they have become iconic signs in our time, which are also moving toward a kind of monumentalization, which produces a collective energy. So I guess I am a little bit on the side of the workers and the collective, the mass, in the moment when they climb the monument. One slide I didn't show you that I particularly love is 1968 at the Democratic National Convention, when one of the equestrian statues in Grant Park was completely covered with human bodies. It was like a tent of humanity going up to the top of the statue, and it was almost like an anthill. People were even climbing over each other and helping each other climb to the top of it. So this moment when the mass renounces being an ornament to power, the Krakauer model of the mass ornament, all orchestrated to celebrate the sovereign, but the mass really climbing on the monument or making the monument speak in a new way. That's to me the really interesting moment. And Mick wrote about this with Occupy as well, the way people turned themselves into statues at Occupy, kind of hybrid centaurs, part sign, part image, and posed there for the photographers.
Which is again the hands up gesture too. I mean, this is statuary, spontaneous statuary. Allow me two comments. One about the Machu Picchu and this sarcastic attitude of shaman Santiago. Mm-hmm.
This is what's so difficult for anybody to understand.
Oh, it was totally straightforward.
When you're so wrong.
Well, the interesting thing is that you also mentioned Neruda.
It was astonishing, though, Machu Picchu. I mean, he got it so right.
I just wanted to say that actually it's the other way around. It's the same way with Neruda, who you mentioned as well, who wrote this famous poem Alturas de Machu Picchu, and the legend has it that when Neruda arrived and as a good Chilean that of course is, like very irritated by Peru and its beauty, when he arrived to Machu Picchu, he said like, what a great place for a roast, for a barbecue, what a great place for barbecuing, like, like.
Say that?
Yeah, well, that's what Chileans said.
Yeah, because the Chileans have such miserable food. They all go to Peru to get a decent meal. So this is, the guy is acting out his Chileanism.
The other thing I wanted to, the other comment that I just can't keep to myself is that, Tom, you spoke about Tatlin's tower. And actually, the interesting thing is that, of course, it's not to be inhabited, and it's certainly just a scaffolding and not exactly a sculpture. But the plan was that it was going to operate as an antenna, broadcasting continuously revolutionary messages and poetry and so on. And I think that's an element of performance that is very interesting in the very idea of the monument. And if we think etymologically about the term monument, actually it's something that reminds. And in that reminding, there's already an element of performing a task, right? I would like to go back to your difference between the monument and the document, and looking at Mick's slides, because one of your last slides on the recent events of protest against racist police brutality, we see these two African-American women kneeling, stopping the traffic, and then you see people photographing them already. And I have the feeling that's a very interesting case of how the monumentalization of this event is also the documentation. And I would like to, I think one of the most interesting part of your presentation was this difference and this dialectic between the document and the monument background and foreground. So what could you tell us in terms of this simultaneity of monumentalizing and documenting today?
Yeah, well, I think, it isn't actually my invented concept. It really comes out of canonical art history, out of Panofsky. But Panofsky, I think, was intelligent enough to see that it was a dialectical relationship, also discipline-specific, so that the relation of monument and document was a kind of a circle, an organic situation rather than a vicious circle. But just to pick up on your point about Tatlin's tower and its function as a broadcast mechanism, the most recent project that has been proposed to the Astor Gates in Chicago was, couldn't you produce some kind of civic monument for the 95th Street L station? We want you to make something at the station which will commemorate the greatness of the South Side and everything, the kind of lost greatness, because it's generally regarded as a blighted neighborhood. And Theaster thought about it for quite a while, and then finally came up with something that, like Morris's bomb monument, it didn't exactly please them immediately. He said, I want to build a radio station at the L stop, and I want to take the $1 million you're proposing to spend on this and treat it as the salary for 5 years for a very gifted DJ. I'll interview a bunch of people, and that DJ will have to understand the history of the South Side, the poetry, music, fiction, all the cultural resources that come from it. And this station will be broadcasting to the South Side its own memories and its own history. And it struck me as exactly right. Then the city said, well, okay, on one condition, we want you to hang some fire hoses in it as well. So they had to have some visual art in there, even though they said, a radio station, what's that? Is a radio tower monumental? I think it will be.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, it's interesting that actually the dialectic between document and monument is already in Riegel's canonic text, but for him there's some sort of equivalence. The document is the monument when it's just at the stage of, let's say, standing, as a token of something that happened and that has disappeared, whereas the monument implies some sort of intentionality that sooner or later the document will acquire, right? Anyway, I think it's a good moment to open the mic to all sorts of questions from you. Thank you, Adriana, for helping us circulate it. But is there a first question, maybe, somewhere?
Looming behind the wonderful engraving of the Tatlin Tower that has been projected, in the Russian, the first word is not artists, it's inžinieri, which I parse as when the genius is gone, the ingenious get going. I guess my question is, in an age where art seems to be going, but beyond our control, how does implementation actually take place? Is art really the domain where these questions can be moved forward? And that's why I think Theaster Gates is such a great example of an artist who's striving to leave the building, as Jimmy has always done, as David Hammonds did very, very early in the game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I can only say, in a way, it's not a question. It's I agree with you that Theaster is trying to set out a new way, a new model of creating monuments in which the monumentalization, the self-importance of them and their relation to the artist is pretty much effaced. A lot of it does, although, depend on his charisma to get people mobilized to carry on. Because the other day he just hired a kind of manager to assess the business situation of what his artworks are doing. He said he now has 27 different corporations, this network. And the reason for that is to limit your liability, but also to distribute responsibility so that when you create something, it isn't, people don't go around saying, oh, that's a Theaster Gates. I mean, they may know that, they may see his signature on it, but much more important is that's a place where we can do something, where something can happen. So he's constantly giving this stuff to the community with the idea that they should do something with it. And since he comes from the community, this is, so I think of him as a kind of Gramscian artist, working in an organic way within a community. Of course, the work travels, the model travels. It's gone now to Gary, to Cleveland, to Detroit, to other, quote, blighted cities that are blighted largely around racial issues. And so that's why I think it's extraordinarily powerful. It's, in a way, not so much about him, but about a collective monument that is, a place to hang out in the kind of most modest version of it. The Currency Exchange Cafe has become the hottest destination on the South Side now. Everybody taking the L to this station that nobody would go to before, but now there's this great cafe next to an art space.
Any other questions? Oh. Well, I was here. I'm sorry.
Thank you for your interesting talks. I have a question for Professor Mitchell. Could you maybe specify the difference between a monument and a memorial? Because I think there is a difference, especially under this perspective which you called the dialectic of death and life, because maybe you could say these two things are on the two different sides of the same coin, but especially the opposite in a way, because the relation between life and death may be different, or what would you say to this? Thank you.
Well, I'm tempted to ask you, since you know what the difference is, why don't you tell us, and then I'll react to that. What do you think the difference is between a monument and a memorial?
No, I don't know it. But for example, if you, was a few days ago, I visited this memorial for 9/11, and then you have, for example, you have this Freedom Tower there, as you would say, a classical monument, and on the other hand, you have the memorial, and And in a way, they seem to be in a way, I would say, opposites, but at the same time very close, because you in your examples you put them together. This Vietnam memorial, this as an example, among others. So I asked myself, especially under this dialectic you named of death and life and overcome death. But these memorials are, of course, a memory of death in the first place, of dying, of victims, of suffering. So, and also a sign for vulnerability, of course. Not so much for strength, like monuments on the first case seem to be. So maybe I had the idea that they are in a way very related, but also. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, yeah, yes, I do, and I, I think you're right, but I don't believe I really have a very clear answer to this question. I think probably not all memorials are monumental, and some monuments are not memorials. I mean, the Anish Kapoor, the Cloud Gate. Well, it may not be either. It's just a big piece of public sculpture. Which has a kind of magnetism for a popular public that wants to gather and see itself. It's a mechanism for attracting a crowd, a very successful one. Is it a memorial? No, not really. But the word monument, the reason I started with that idea was that this was Riegel's canonical definition of it in 1903. He said, a monument is always about memory, and he said, not about history. It's an attempt to defeat history, which makes the past past. But memory makes the past present. It refuses to allow death to take over. But of course, it always has to fail. You can't defeat death. So that's not really an answer to your question. Mick, do you want to try to do better?
Well, I think maybe we take it case by case. I think there are memorials which swerve away from monumentalization. I would think the Vietnam Memorial in Washington is a case in point. I think the memorial to Benjamin in Port Boo is another case. And that's interesting. That reminds me of Gliese 17 in Berlin, which is a Holocaust memorial I can agree with. And that is, the monument fades away into the landscape and into nature. But I would think, just to start, everybody would have a particular type of memorial which they think the word monument is awkward or even ugly if applied to it.
Yeah, and partly because the monument always seems like it's trying to assert its virility, strength. When we say monumentality, it usually means big, strong, power, force. But there's always this countercurrent of anti-monumentality. And the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, perfect case. Gliese 17, also in Grunewald.
I wonder in this German artist I came across, I think it was in a book by James Young called The Text of Memory or something like that, which is sort of a study of monuments in Germany which are there because of the Second World War. And this statement, very arresting statement, no, I will not make a monument because all monuments are fascist. And it really threw me. And I started to think, well, how? Why? Is it true? And I think that would cut deeply into your question of what is a memorial and what is a monument. Is there something inherently authoritarian, imposing, sucks the breath out of you, and so forth, with the word monument? It's a hell of a word. I mean, the only way you can respond to monument and monumentalization is it encourages a certain anti-monumentalizing impulse.
So thanks. Both talks were so rich. I'm still kind of swimming in everything. But I'm going to pick up on the question, and that'll tie it to what I was actually going to talk about, and so what I would want to propose as a difference between one memorial and one monument that might help us would be the difference between the German cemeteries in Normandy and the American cemeteries in Normandy. And that I almost feel as if the German cemetery is a memorial, whereas the American cemetery becomes more of a monument to courage. And the distinction there, I think, has something to do with the role of historical truth and political regimes and productions of political conceptions of what happened, right? And so what I was gonna, and this ties to the larger point that I wanted to propose was that maybe in thinking about those things that we think of as monumental but not always necessarily monuments, we might be able to find some dimensions that are helpful. So you were talking about, forms of public art that are sometimes monumental but not necessarily monuments. The bean, maybe, I'm not sure. Memorials that are sometimes memorials but not monuments. Spaces of pilgrimage, I think, religious, political pilgrimages, which have a more religious and political dimension but might not be actual monuments, and sometimes ruins that have, so Machu Picchu might be monumental, but it might not be itself a monument. And so these are dimensions of objects that are monumental but not necessarily monuments, then might help us see something about the monument as being only valid as a monument in a particular period that constructed by its historicity and placement in a political context. And that's why maybe the German cemetery is not a monument, but it's just a memorial, right? If
the Americans is about courage, what is the German cemeteries about? I haven't seen these myself, so can you tell us what is the virtue if courage goes with the American?
Well, that was picking up on your original statement that monuments are two icons of, but monuments too. And so in that context, it does seem as if we visit the American cemeteries as a monument to courage, as a monument to, et cetera, in a different way. And they look, of course, very different, right? But the German cemeteries tend to be sort of black crosses, much more low to the ground. The white cemeteries are these white, stretching, etc. But I, and it might not be true. I mean, I'm not sure how people visit these spaces, but that difference has something to do with the fact to make it a monument, it only lasts in a particular political context and in a political and historical context. I don't think the Lenin statues anymore are the same type of monument or something. They're some kind of relic, whereas they used to be monuments.
They will be preserved in that case, maybe. If they're a relic, I don't know.
It's a great observation, which we could run with for a long time, I think. There's a place called Arlington West, next to Santa Monica Pier. I think is every Sunday a kind of temporary cemetery for not just American soldiers, but for fighters all over the Arab world are memorialized there. It's, of course, an anti-war monument, which appears and disappears on a weekly basis, and is accompanied by a kind of information gallery to educate people about how many people in Afghanistan, how many people died in Afghanistan today, How many people died in Iraq and Syria and so forth? As if it was about living memory, things that we're forgetting that are happening right now. So I think you're right. I mean, I think, to come back to your question before, there is an important difference and it's partly a matter of triumphalism versus melancholy. To me, the World Trade Center memorial is a deeply melancholy memorial. In fact, I have to confess, I really hate it. I think it's trying to keep open a bleeding wound forever. It's a refusal to give up your trauma and work through it, but just to continually remind you of death and bleeding. That's what it looks like to me.
I actually had a question for Tom. It's about landscape and power, and I think often going back and looking at that book, there is a sense that invisibility in the landscape is really about reinforcing colonial ideas and ideas of manifest destiny. But in your recent book, Occupy, the empty space becomes a space, a monument to civic unrest. And I was wondering if you would elaborate on the differences between those two.
Well, I see the empty space of Occupy, actually, in something like the way that Mick was laying out. The Occupy is also a rhetorical trope, occupatio. The feeling that you're overwhelmed, you're unable to say what it is that you want, that you need, that you demand, except by being present. In a way, that's what I thought Occupy was about. It was, and remember, it was criticized relentlessly for refusing to state its demands, for refusing to sign on to a program, to imitate the Tea Party and produce an explicit ideology. They spoke, exercised the right of free speech by being there, by occupying. And Bernard, who just asked the previous question, we were both at the courtroom hearing where the clever Irish lawyer arguing with the conservative Irish judge said, "Your Honor, they're camping in Grant Park not because they need a place to sleep, but because by being there they are saying something. It is a speech act, a reversal of speech act, action speaking louder than words." So, yes, that empty space, also the silence that goes with it. I do wish that the World Trade Memorial were silent instead of overwhelming with the thunderous waterfall that drowns out thought and conversation. But
maybe a last
Mick, do you want to weigh in on this? No?
Maybe a last question before we close the session.
I have one footnote and one question. The footnote is kind of an association that I had both with the idea of agency of monuments and this animation and also the defacement. And I think that there's this beautiful story of the monument of Charles Fourier in Paris that was the bronze statue was stolen by the Nazis and basically turned into bullets. So Charles Fourier was basically technically like shot out of German cannons, and then the plinth is still empty. And I think it's interesting that it's relating to a lot of things you were talking about. I have a question related to the question of about authorship of the discourse of monuments, the question of like bottom up versus top down of the construction of the discourse, and obviously like the history of monuments is dominated by the top down definition of what the monument and icon should be, but obviously as Professor Taussig was very interestingly talking about, it is always going in parallel with things that are happening bottom up. But I'm curious what you think about what's happening in contemporary culture with, for example, the memes, the viral culture and memes, internet memes, and culture of the selfie, the technological impact of how icons circulate, and is it at all changing, altering the landscape of how the bottom-up tendencies for creation of icons, maybe monuments was a question mark, is it shifting anything, or is it the same? Has it always been present?
That's a great question. I was thinking about it quite a bit the last week. I was tending to think that the digital revolution has greatly debilitated the monument and made it even weaker than it was before. That was my first gut reaction. Yeah, I was wondering if we could add to your question, however, the question of surveillance. The fact that we know not only does the viral spread, the virus spreads, the information, the images, and so forth have this infinite capacity for dissemination. But if you add to that the fact that you know that it could work against you or could work against a group or whatever it is. What does that do to the flaw in the monument, the invisibilization of the monument, the fact that monuments seem to be begging for their defacement, if not demise? There's something cracked in the very notion of this thing that will be built out of steel and stone and last forever, right? So that's, I have nothing more concrete than that, but it's a question that has occurred to me quite a bit. What has happened since the 1990s as regards? No doubt earnest people will want monuments, and that will go on, and that'll be a political issue, you know, about making political capital out of having a statue to some famous thing. The question of memorials, though, cuts across that. The memorial seems to me much more subtle notion. And that's again where I would think, well, how would you make a memorial? What would you put into it? You know, to me, it's a different type of attitude or focus towards these questions. If you sit down and think how you would memorialize something, it has some sort of permanency, but maybe not, you know, stone or marble. Jimmy Durham's work struck me as very interesting. I didn't emphasize enough that he makes stuff out of wood. You saw them, feathers. Very hard to preserve. He likes PVC piping a hell of a lot, too much. And these objects are small, you know, and then I think of artists I know who make things out of bronze and stuff like that, and I think, oh, we are in a different world here, you know. Anyway, that was just my pitch towards, how shall I put it, thinking through making. It would seem to me a nice way to work this difference between monuments and memorials. But certainly your question is one that has caught my imagination too.
Maybe a last comment from Professor Tom Mitchell.
Well, I think you put your finger on something, a process that started even before the digital revolution, probably with Benjamin's account of what mechanical reproduction was doing to the sphere of image life, that it was producing a kind of decay of the art historical monument to begin with, that the masterpiece no longer had the same presence because reproduced so easily and its effigy circulated so widely. So I think this is a process that's been going on for some time, but the invention of the internet and the digital image, I think, accelerates it. So it's as if the plague of images, or the viral character of images now, really overwhelms the old idea of the monument as this sort of guarantee of stability, longevity, durability, the resistance to time and history, the preservation of living memory, and that the meme, as you mentioned, that is, what is the meme? I have a graduate student in anthropology at Chicago who wants to write his thesis on the meme, And frankly, I don't understand it myself. I know it's a word and image combination, and some of them catch on, some of them go viral. But I think that whole image economy is, to some extent, hostile to, but also perhaps supportive of a certain kind of state power. The old model, by the way, of 1984, Bernard and I are going to be teaching a course on surveillance this winter at Columbia and Chicago, a course connected virtually by teleconferencing. That there's this, the figure of Big Brother, remember, was a media monument. Big Brother is watching you. Big Brother is also producing spectacles for you to entertain, to subjugate. It was both spectacle and surveillance. Now, largely the question we're asking is, what's happened to the relation of spectacle and surveillance in our time, when it's as if the monumental expansion of the ability not only of the state, but of corporate capital to watch over you at every moment. I mean, now my fingerprint can open up my iPhone. When I first did, I thought, what am I doing? I'm giving away my fingerprints to Apple. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it makes it quicker to turn it on, but it also makes it easier for me to be tracked wherever I go. Walking through the village last night, I got lost, so I turned on GPS, and I could see my little dot moving along the street. I realized I'm not the only one who can see that. So we live in an era where the big other, the big monument, is really quite invisible. And as Bernard has been arguing, not only invisible, but we are totally complicit in it. We're always giving ourselves to it. So it's a very dangerous situation, I think, when the monument's no longer there to be seen. You can't go up and deface it. You'd have to basically throw your iPhone into the fire. And I'm not about to do that. It's, so the big other, the big brother, is still there. We just he hides his face in a way that was not so evident before.
Well, this could go on forever, and we'll be as enchanted. And I think this has been an incredible evening. I mean, I'm so tempted to continue and respond to what you just said, but I'm not going to do it. I will make two announcements. Since you spoke about 9/11 Memorial, this will be deeply discussed in our next Discussions in Contemporary Culture event in May with Rosalind Deutsch and Chris Kraus. And another announcement is that the Columbia Center for Contemporary Critical Thought on Monday will have a special session with Professor Mitchell again on Avi Warburg. And thank you, Bernard, for coming and relaying the information, because I think it will be a fantastic event from 12 to 2 at the Columbia Law School, 116th in Amsterdam, and it will be on Avi Warburg. So thank you all for coming. This has been wonderful, and see you soon again. Bye-bye.